Welcome to the Coach's Table Podcast, where coaches come to grow personally and professionally through real-world application and online education. What is going on today? June is flying by. The weather's getting beautiful. I'm spending time at the beach, which is great, and I love it. But I'm excited because basketball starts Monday. Basketball starts Monday, and we're getting back into the swing of things. And I think this is where it gets really fun. I think this is where coaches get back after vacay, and everybody's excited and ready to train hard. But also excited just to kind of be with each other, just to start to be with each other again, and just to kind of spend more time together. And I think that's a lot of fun too. So today's guest, I'm very excited to have on. He's a good friend of mine, and I love seeing his success, and I love seeing where he's at. And I think you guys will too. I think you guys will get a lot from this, and I'm very excited about it. But before we introduce him, before we get going, guys, just like every episode, if you get something from this, do us a huge favor and share the show. Okay, we're growing rapidly, which is amazing. We're very close to 2K downloads, and we'll hit it here probably within the next day. And that's super exciting, and I'm very pumped for this, even though this will be released way after that. Like today, if I time stamp this date right now, within the next day or two, June 22nd, we'll hit 2K downloads pretty soon. So that's super exciting. So do us a huge favor, share the show, okay? Because we're growing on Spotify and YouTube. If you're on YouTube, okay, do us a huge favor, hit the subscribe button. It takes 10 seconds to do that. I would really appreciate that. And do us a huge favor, drop the comments on the YouTube page as well. Love seeing that. So a good friend of mine, men and women's basketball strength coach at Drexel University, Mr. Chris Hayes. What's up, man?
This episode is sponsored by TeamBuildr. TeamBuildr is the #1 performance platform for strength coaches around the world. Their software provides coaches with an elevated experience when it comes to program development, data tracking, and staying connected with athletes and clients. Coaches also have access to consultations with TeamBuildr's in-house sports scientists to help them manage and analyze data. Head to teambuildr.com and sign up with promo code TABLE to start your 30-day free trial. That's TeamBuildr, TeamBuildr.com with promo code TABLE to start your free 30-day trial.
Kendrick, what's up, man? How you doing? Great. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Man, yeah, thank you for coming on, bro. Chris and I met each other when I was at West Point, actually, and we had a great conversation. It was so cool. We just got to be able to kick it for several hours and just kind of hang out, and then seeing what he's doing at Drexel, with both men and women's is really, really cool. So, Chris, for the people that are in that men and women's role, that dual role, man, how is that adjustment for you coming from where you were at prior to where you maybe just had men's or just had one? Like, how's that dual role for you?
It's fun, man, because, for anybody who's worked with men and women, obviously there's some different dynamics, and that can be a lot of fun and also a good challenge as a coach. But it certainly is, on the flip side, challenging as well, because you're trying to be in two places at once, as much as you can. Quite literally. And I finally have some interns this summer that started this week, and I was able to go to a meeting and let them cover the weight room and just some voluntary stuff this week. And I said, guys, I feel like I can finally be in two places at once. You guys can be an extension of me. So, yeah, man, it's a challenge because you're trying to make both staffs happy and obviously give the kids the best possible product and extra work and be at practice and games and travel. So ultimately one team, gets a short end of the stick sometimes. But trying to do the best I can here, in this role to cover them as best as possible.
Yeah, man, I it's so interesting that occurs, because it's like, hey, one group is practicing, it just happens to work out that another group wants to lift at that time of practice, and you're like, come on, man, or vice versa, or they both want to lift at the same time, or they both want to practice at the same time. You're like, okay, this doesn't help,
Well, and it doesn't happen nearly as much, if at all, really, here at Drexel.
Sure.
But it did happen a lot at Coppin, where when I was in the same role, where I would become like the middleman.
Yeah.
And the men's program would say, "Oh, we want this time," and the women's program, "Oh, well, we want that time." And then I'm figuring out court times and I'm like, guys, like I don't want to be this person. Like take me out of this. But no, that's much better at Drexel here. But you do get caught in the middle every once in a while.
Man, it's so true. You become their logistical guy,
Right.
you know, and you're like, okay, well, hey, the men want to go at this time, and the women are like, okay, and they're like, well, why does that affect me? And you're like, well, that affects me, which inadvertently like affects you. So, you know, it's like you're always kind of balancing. You're always on that teeter-totter, and it's just like, I don't know, maybe not, you know, from that standpoint. So it's tough, it's good, but it's a challenge at times though too, you know.
It is, man. It is, but it'll make me better. And you know, if at one point, one day, whether it's Drexel or somewhere else, whether we create another position here or eventually, you know, if I move on, if and when I am one team only, and you know, even more spoiled to just have one basketball instead of both, like it'll make it that much easier, you know, and I'll be able to dive that much deeper with that group. So, you know, I try to take that perspective with it.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so doing a real quick, you know, reflecting upon last year for y'all. You know, looking at what you guys did from a training standpoint, looking at what you guys did from a win-loss standpoint, because let's be honest, we're all judged on our wins and losses. You know, what are a couple things you're like, hey, we did really, really well in this category or these things, and then, hey, we're definitely trying to improve on that, you know, this next year. I think that's one thing that, you know, a lot of people should do more of, is like taking that step to reflect upon how the year went, and then, hey, what are we going to implement this year to hopefully, you know, fix that or adjust that or make that process better.
Yeah, I'll start with the positive because we talked about the negative a little bit off air, and I'll get to that. And I've certainly beat myself up about that enough, so I'll try to talk positive first. I think the two things that come to mind, the first one I wasn't really able to do at Coppin because I was so involved with logistics and meals and other game day stuff, was game day lifts. And they were optional across the board, and mostly walk-ons and non-rotation players. Occasionally we'd get a starter or you know, a rotation player. But kind of building that culture where, hey, like it's not mandatory, right? You can come in on your own. And, you know, I'll share stuff on Instagram sometimes where it might just be a menu or a template or a couple options, and they pick an option or two, and then I just help them build it out. You know, I'm a big believer in autonomy when you give it to them at the right time. So that was a kind of a big win for me. We've talked about, you know, we're focused on the summer right now. We're not quite planning out next season yet, but we have talked about the idea of, okay, when we get to in season, instead of just having, you know, of course, 2 team lifts, unless you're micro dosing or have an awesome ability to train 5 times a week, like we train two times a week for the most part in season, at least formally as a team, mandatory. But we've talked about on the men's side and hopefully on the women's side, the idea of a third exposure, you know, almost like an NBA model where you need X amount per week or X amount per month. And it's like, hey, get it however you want it. But for us, it would be, okay, we're going to have our 2 team lifts, but then you need a third exposure with Chris, whether that's an extra lift, extra conditioning, mobility, regen, whatever, like stuff outside of the team schedule, to kind of build that autonomy, but allow for the individualization as well. So anyway, I think that was one big win, man. And I think just, you know, this is still a new role at Drexel. This will be the 3rd year that Drexel has had this role. So it was my first year this past year. And then they had a guy named Kyle, who was awesome the first year in that role. He moved on to the G League, but I think building consistency and sustainability in the role where both staffs, you know, the men's staff, I believe, is going on year 7. Women's staff, head coach Amy and associate Stacy, they've been here for about almost 20 years. So they were very used to not having a basketball only strength coach. They were very used to the strength coach just being truly the weight room guy and maybe occasionally the warm up guy and maybe very occasionally travel. And that was Coach Rankin because he was here by himself. Or had one assistant. So it's bringing the other things to the table, nutrition, recovery, extra shakes, right? Things of that nature, like all the other things that we can bring to the table from a performance standpoint. Obviously, load management. We've got some technology this year, force plates, polar. So being like, hey, like lifting is, I hate to say it's the easy part, but that's the easy part. But let me help with all these other things too, right? And try to impact performance more holistically. So I think we've opened the door on those conversations a little bit more over this past year. We're certainly not at that quote unquote high performance type of model yet, but I think we're getting there. So those would be the 2 positives. come to mind.
Staying on that real quick, hang on. Staying on that real quick for those that, because you've kind of opened the door for conversation on that, what would you tell somebody if they're walking into a situation where they're not at a high performance level, or they don't have the door open for those conversations? What would you tell them to be like, here's how I approached it, or here's a good way to approach it? Because I feel like there's so many people that want to do that. They want to get additional tech, if you will, but they don't necessarily know how to have that conversation. What would you kind of recommend there?
Well, I think being patient comes to mind. And that's, to be honest, like, I shared with you off air, like I had to be kind of sat down once or twice this year and, hey, Chris, and this was Coach Rankin, our director, not a head coach or sports staff. It was like, hey, man, you're doing a great job, but you got to pump your brakes a little bit. Like, it takes time, right? It takes time to make changes. So you're doing great stuff, but let's slow it down a little bit. So I think being patient is something I could have did a little bit better this year. But I think meeting the staffs where they're at with things, right, and offering ideas or suggestions in those other areas that they're not used to, and picking your spots, obviously picking your battles. But I think probably the most important thing, man, is just being great at what you are able to do, right? Which for me was warm-ups, strength training, some supplemental conditioning, kind of the basics, things of that nature. Show them that you're really good and know what you're doing with that. Build the athlete, obviously buy-in and trust and respect. And dare I say, it helps if they like you too. Because if our best players like me and the coaches trust the best player. So, for example, like game day lifts or the lift before a game, a day before a game, excuse me. If the best players are like, yeah, no, we're not lifting, like we're good on that, then it might not happen. But if the best players go to coach and be like, oh yeah, like Chris is cool, like we trust him, like it's fine, then it might happen. So I think all that stuff's important too.
I think I think everything you hit on is important, but the last part I really want to emphasize. When I was at Illinois Springfield D2 school, it same situation, right? I mean, no resources. We trained at our student rec center, 4 racks, like nothing, right? And I'm like, we got to do this high-low model. Like training on game day is the best thing for us. Let's consolidate stress, like, telling everybody everything. And to your exact point, though, it's like I left it optional. But it was just like some people wanted to, some people didn't. The better athletes wanted to. The people that didn't particularly care didn't particularly care, right? And that's really interesting. I was like, who do you have to win over on the team from a player standpoint to maybe give yourself a little bit more to do? You know what I'm saying? Or to get more, right? And it's like the captains or the older people or whatever the case may be, because it's like if they like you and trust in what you're doing, 9 times out of 10, you can make this stuff that you want to have happen because they're like, yeah, Chris is the guy, Chris is the man. I think that's so important, and a lot of people sometimes maybe miss that.
Absolutely, man. It's a people business above anything else, right?
Man, it is. Cool. Finishing back up, coming back around, but a couple of things to work on, improve on, man. I mean, everybody has things to improve on. It doesn't have to be you personally, but like, man, I think we could do better at whatever the case may be,
Yeah, I think, I think it's our continued integration and collaboration as a performance team, right? So we have a dietitian. Obviously, we have athletic trainers. We're going to have, I believe, a new sports psych role this upcoming academic year. So continuing to work towards that high performance model, right? There's, of course, ideals and then what's realistic, but continuing to improve our process. And I think on a more tangible and specific level to S&C, as I shared with you, this year was tough from an injury standpoint. And I don't have the numbers crunched from, the last 5 years for Cobb and 1 here at Drexel, but I'm pretty sure in terms of, games and practices missed, this was the toughest year for me on both sides. So that certainly, weighed on me because I do put almost maybe too much value in that at times in this year. But yeah, on the women's side, we had 2 non-contact ACLs, 1 little bit of contact involved, but officially non-contact. And then on the men's side, almost everybody, except for 1 guy, made it through the season. But a lot of guys had lingering stuff that we were able to manage, and I thought we did a good job of managing it, but had a few postseason surgeries to get things cleaned up. So, as I shared with you, man, like I spent a lot of time at the end of the season and in the spring, like, man, I thought I did a great job and did this, like first time I did that, like thought I did as good of a job, if not hopefully the best job. Hopefully we're getting better every year as I have in the past 5 in this basketball role. And I'm like, man, we were still banged up. We still had these injuries. They were my first ACLs, first non-contact ACLs. And I almost was, I'm young and naive still, right? Like I thought, oh, maybe I'm immune to them. Like our stuff is so good. Like it's not going to happen. Right. And then one happened. And then 4 weeks later, another happened. And it's like, oh my God, like maybe I am not as good as I thought, or maybe we're doing something wrong. So there was certainly a lot of evaluation and auditing that went into that. And that could be a whole podcast in and of itself and a whole rabbit hole. And I'm happy to speak to it more. But that was the biggest piece of evaluation for me. Yeah. And so I think, improving our consistency with our training, a little more so on the women's side, but both sides. And then just, I think consistency of having the same person in this role will help, right? Mm-hmm. Because when Kyle left, there was a couple months of a layoff where training was a little inconsistent from the end of the season to the spring. And then, some inconsistency at the end of the last season. So anyway, man, I think as we keep consistency, right, and I'm in this role for the second year, I think that will help. And like I said, continuing to improve our collaboration with the performance team. I had an awesome meeting with our women's AT today about our assessment process with the girls this summer, and some things we're going to do differently that we haven't done before that I think will help. So just continuing to try to move the needle in the right direction, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, man. And I want to stay there for a second, because for the if you're listening right now, Chris is not the only one in this position, right? Where you're doing a year in review and you're saying, oh man, like I really thought I was really good at this stuff, but this year kind of threw a curveball. This year, we had some things happen that it kind of shook me a little bit, right? Maybe that you thought you were immune to, or you haven't seen, or whatever the case may be. You're definitely not the only one in that seat. And for those of you that are in that seat and struggling, it's very difficult. Like it's tough. Kind of walk me, Chris, if you will, through your mindset thought process of, okay, I'm here. I recognize this. One, what were you thinking and feeling kind of throughout the process, like as it happened? And then where are you kind of at today a little bit? Because I feel like time is a beautiful thing, right? And it gives you some perspective, and it gives you the ability to maybe detach a little bit, see a different perspective. So kind of where were you at, like when that occurred? And then, kind of where you're at today from like your mindset thought process on it.
Yeah. Well, it started more so on the women's side. So our first ACL was mid-December, December 15th. And like I said, there was a little contact involved, but it was officially deemed non-contact. But looking at the mechanism and everything is like, okay, like, I awkward, tough position. Obviously, we don't want it to happen, but like, all right, it happened. And we audited it a little bit, but probably not as much as we should have. And then 4 weeks later, January 10th, the second one happened. It's like, oh, shoot. And at the same time, we had a third girl who at that point was 5 to 6 months returning from an ACL from last spring during pickup. We also had 2 other girls on the team who had ACLs in the last 18 to 24 months and had played basically through last season and have been good, knock on wood at the time. But I'm like, oh, shoot. We have 3 other girls who are also at risk, because we know previous injury is the number one risk of re-injury.
Yep. I'm
like, man, 1 is tough, 2 is bad. But now I'm holding my breath, because I'm like, man, are we doing all the right stuff with everybody else? And I will say that was huge, having the force plates, man, from Vulcan Dynamics. They're awesome. We didn't get them until basically Thanksgiving, so we didn't start using them until around December 1. Sure. So we were very much still kind of collecting baseline data at that point, and really through the whole season, those first few months. But we were able to see some things with the girl returning from surgery and the other 2 girls that did have an ACL surgery in the past in their history. And we were able to have some conversations and make some minor changes in the weight room that I felt, who knows, man, and that's the thing, like injuries happen, right? But the injuries that don't happen, did we prevent them? Did we mitigate them, right? Obviously you don't know, right? Because it didn't happen, but that was, as I've reflected over time, like, okay, obviously 2 happened. You don't want any to happen. And I feel bad for those girls for missing the whole season. But maybe we saved 1 or 2 or 3 others from having a re-injury. So that was a little bit of the positive spin on that, I guess, man. And then
Yeah.
On the men's side, like I said, I think all 5 cases of our dudes that have had some type of injury towards or after the season, they all had pre-existing cases in that area or the same exact injury. So for me, it's just having a little bit more of an understanding or sharing that understanding with the coaching staff, especially when it comes to recruiting, right? And incoming freshmen or transfer. Hey, we know they have this history. I'm not saying we can't take them, right? Because they can hoop. But just a little bit of awareness that we're going to have to manage this or they could be at risk. So I think that's one thing, man. But, as I shared with you previously too, like I think I maybe placed a little bit of too much value in availability and trying to quote unquote prevent injuries. And when they happened, as I mentioned earlier, I was like, man, like I almost lost my purpose. And I was like, I put in all these hours and all these days and thought I gave 99%, right? And these things happen. And I'm like, shoot, like, what am I doing this for? And I lost my direction a little bit. And as I've had time to recalculate and recalibrate this spring and had like a nice extended 2-week vacation. So now it's like, okay, maybe I put a little too much weight in that. Although I understand at some levels, and especially at the NBA, like you might get fired, right? If those things happen. Yeah. So obviously that our goal is to reduce injuries, mitigate injuries, one of our top goals. But sometimes the injury bug bites and there's not a whole lot you can do. So, we're going to continue to audit things and make sure we're doing the best job we possibly can, of course. And hopefully next season ends up better. But we'll see, man.
Yeah. It's crazy how daunting or how there's that feels like there's that like cloud over you almost, when you see 1, 2, and then you're like, everybody's got a history of this, which is tough, right? And then that's really tough because that's really tough to shake. It's hard to shake. You can't really, you know what I'm saying? You're like, oh man, like, what do we do? What do we not do? You're like, oh crap. Like, I can't, what do we do, man? And then staying on that for a second, because I feel like everybody goes through this at some point, whether you are currently going through this or whether you will and you just don't know it yet because nobody can see the future. But, kind of losing your purpose a little bit, kind of losing, I don't want to say yourself, but like, that's a struggle in itself too, right? Because now you feel like every day is a little bit of a grind, right? And not the classic, we're grinding to get better, but the classic grind of like, oh crap, I gotta go back in. You know what I'm saying? Like, and so how did you kind of overcome that? I mean, vacation always helps no matter what. But how did you kind of, talk yourself through that or continue to put the best effort in when, you were kind of struggling personally? And everybody goes through this as coaches, like, and if you haven't been coaching long enough, but like, everybody goes through it as coaches, man. How did you kind of like continue to put your best foot forward?
Man, I think, life comes in peaks and valleys, right? Highs and lows, and you don't enjoy the highs as much without the lows and vice versa. So I think one of the spins I've tried to put on it is, okay, we had injuries on both sides. Not necessarily the reason that we didn't win a championship or get to the final game. Although we certainly, that certainly played a part, I think would be fair to say. But okay, like, guess what? I'm going to be here for my second year, right? The first full calendar year. And I'm going to not only improve what I'm doing or what we're doing with S&C, I'm going to push to improve things, across sports performance with nutrition, sleep, recovery, yada, 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 with technology, sports science we're using. And not that I'm going to put all my eggs in this basket because I just learned from this mistake. But hey, maybe come this time next year, right? We have, and the thing with the ACLs too on the women's side is that those were our 5th. So that was number 4 and 5 in 3 years. Right. And, speaking to the 3 girls I mentioned, so that was number 4 and 5 in 3 years. So if we're able to go knock on wood, right, if we can go this season, be a little bit healthier and have no, major dramatic injuries, okay, that'll be a win. That's going to be a motivating factor for me. Not that I'm putting all my weight in that because if it happens, then what again? Right. And on the men's side, man, we have basically everybody returning. We lost one guy, 5th year, graduated. And then we have pretty much everyone returning into incomer. So we have a great opportunity to be successful and compete for a championship, hopefully win a championship. So I just try to think to March next year and I'm not going to put, like I said, all my weight in that. But hopefully both teams are a little healthier, a little more successful next year, and that's what I'm going to work for.
Yeah, I feel that that's a great way to look at it. Hey, last year it's done and over with. We can't do anything. We can't change it. Right. The only thing we can do is continue to move forward. Right. And I feel like a lot of coaches, you see this a lot of times, like we rest on our laurels. Right. And whether that's because we've had successful seasons. So we win championships around here. So we're going to do it this way because we've always done it that way because we've won championships. It's like, well, okay, great. It doesn't mean we can't get better. Right.
Yeah.
Or, man, we're always injured, so we're always going to be injured. And so it's just like, well, that's not true either, right? Like neither of them are always true, right? And fighting that good fight, fighting that battle, it's tough, man. It's a tough mental battle consistently because, it's crazy how bad energy spreads faster than good energy, right? And at times it can be it can be tough at times to still be a positive light, and it can be tough to continue to encourage people and be optimistic when everybody's looking at it and they're like, I'm not seeing a way out. I'm not seeing the light, but it's great because I feel like we do. What's great about our role is I feel like we continue to be a light even in the darkness,
Yeah.
And I think that's really important, and it's difficult, but it's really important. It's needed too,
Absolutely, man. I think the good side of it or the positive side, as you're saying, is like no one blamed me. There were certainly questions asked, but the athletes especially, I never felt any animosity or like, oh, this is your fault, right? Because they understand that it is multifactorial. But yeah, like the bright side with those two young ladies and with the guys that have been rehabbing all spring is like, hey man, I'm gonna do the best I can and the best we can to have you bigger, faster, stronger, et cetera, healthier, whatever, hooping better than you ever have. So that's, the positive spin of it and trying to be, still a mentor and a coach and a leader for them.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. So to switch roles a little bit here, as we get better, as our training gets better, as we get more educated, I think that's something that's really important as well. But, there's concepts, there's methods, there's principles, there's, application things that other people are aware of that others are not of, or that implement more, right? And for instance, like maybe it's a PRI thing, maybe it's an FRC thing, maybe it's a fascial thing. And I know you kind of do a little bit of all of those or a little bit of some of those. And so I'm interested from you, not saying that you're the expert on it because I don't think you would ever claim that, but there's some people that know more, some people that don't, but I don't know anything about this stuff, if I'm being very honest with you. And so I'm interested from your perspective, what you're learning and how you're implementing that. And I know we kind of talked a little bit, but whether it's fascial, FRC, whether it's PRI, all the above, what do you typically implement? And then how do you do that? And what do you kind of like about those things that make you implement them?
Yeah, man, I think, speaking to the fascial stuff, as you said, and I told you, I am by no means an expert.
Yeah.
I'm not even going to talk about all the different lines and things of that nature. I'm not there yet. I still need to read an Anatomy Trains, which is a textbook, semester level type of a book and read. But, it's something I began to dive into and had, familiarity with FMS in the past and got certified in that a few years ago. And then did a PRI course and was like, oh, that kind of went over my head, but I get the basics of it in terms of the diaphragm and structural asymmetry. And then FRC came along a little more recently. I took their course this past spring and loved it. Just a little tougher to implement, in my opinion. I'm still working through that. But the fascial stuff is the stuff that's really grown on me the most over the past few years. I think part of that was during COVID, when we had to get a little more creative with our training, whether we were outside, limited space, equipment, whatever. I had a pro guy outside at the time who was turning 30. So, heavy barbells were not an option because we were outside during COVID, but it also wasn't what he was into. So I had to get a little more creative with our training. And at that same time, I was going through some AFS stuff. So that's applied functional sciences through the Gary Gray Institute. So him and his son, just like FMS, FRC, they have kind of their methodology and their website, and they have their courses and certifications. And so I started to go through that stuff at a similar time. have taken 2 of their courses, both of which are great. Chain reaction, and then their AFS, which is kind of their, the heart of what they do. And that, man, is just, it's all about 3D training in 3D, right? So squat, hinge, push, pull, like all that stuff is still cool. But instead of just living in the sagittal plane, it's doing it frontal plane, transverse plane, right? Nothing revolutionary or crazy new that hopefully we're all not doing in some capacity. But I think the concept of training in all 3 planes, or omnidirectional, as they call it, multiple planes at once, right? And then pairing, upper and lower movements together, whether it's a rotational lunge or, challenging a contralateral sling, cross body, above body, whatever. Just that type of stuff began to make more sense to me and just felt more athletic. I don't think it's where you start an athlete, or a freshman day 1, week 1, or even year 1, potentially. But I think it's stuff that as you build the more traditional qualities of strength and power and fitness and all that, I think it's something that can kind of put all that together, right? And maybe make them a little bit more of a better athlete or allow for better transference. So again, I can't speak to it at too much of a higher level than that. I can tell, a great book I have right here that I read this past year is a great reference, Fascia Training, from Bill Parisi and John Allen. They do a great job of kind of simplifying it. Basically, Bill Parisi travels around the world and interviews, 6, 7, 8 or so experts, quote unquote experts, and they all are legit people. You'll know who they are, that are doing different things in the fascia world. And just a ton of great stories and anecdotes. The one thing I can share is, and part of the reason we don't know a ton about fascia, we're just starting to kind of learn about it more recently, is obviously anatomy comes from, I'm losing the word, when someone dies, you do the, what's it called?
Cadavers.
Thank you. I didn't do any cadavers. That's why couldn't think of it. But in undergrad or PT school or med school, you go through cadavers, right? And that's one of the best ways to learn typical or traditional anatomy. But when people die and you go through a cadaver, the fascia disappears. I forget if it's immediately or after a certain number of days. But when you go into cadavers, you don't see the fascia at all. It just dissipates. So that's why it's not in traditional anatomy textbooks, or talked about very little, if at all. Stu McGill has done a ton of research and talks about it a ton. He's in the book. But anyway, man, it's definitely something that I still want to learn more about. I have a lot more to learn about. But that's been kind of the rabbit hole I've been trying to go down a little bit more the last few years.
Yeah. So, okay. Because I don't know much about it at all. Can you, for those that are listening, give them like, what is fascia, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then how are you implementing some of the stuff you've learned so far?
Yeah. So fascia, I'm sure I'm not going to do a great job of this or textbook level job, but basically it's another layer of tissue that wraps around everything, around the muscle, and connects everything, right? So we know that obviously we have our muscle groups and our different sections of the body, quads, hamstring, calf, etc., right? And we can train them in isolation, right? And even in compound movements, we have multiple joints and obviously multiple muscle groups moving together. But fascia basically wraps all the way from the feet all the way up to your head, right? And so if I just move my head, there's to some degree something going down all the way, kinetic chain reaction all the way down to my feet. So it's just the idea that all of that stuff is connected. And if you have the right type of cross-body movement or counter loading, contralateral loading, things of that nature, that will kind of sync up together and create kind of that. They talk about the term tensegrity. It's kind of tension and integrity, tensegrity. It's a physics term. But everything just links up together and works in sync a little more fluidly. So that's, again, that's probably not the best job, certainly not the best explanation or definition that you'll hear. But that's my best kind of textbook / practical explanation for you here.
Sure. It's really interesting because here's why. I think most people know that there's a posterior sling and an anterior sling, right? Mm-hmm. And I will say that's about the extent of my knowledge. Now I understand kind of where the slings are located and the things of that standpoint and stuff, but I personally don't know much more than that. And so it's always interesting to hear people and kind of ask people what they're learning about how they're implementing it, obviously you're still learning, just like I think everybody still is, no matter what it is, right?
Of course.
But how are you kind of taking that and applying it with your athletes, and how are you kind of like implementing some of that stuff you're learning with training, whether it is specifically fascial related or FRC related, or PRI related, because I don't know that much about PRI. I know kind of the large overview, but I don't know, like, I've had some people on to talk about it, but I don't know like the nuts and the bolts. And even some of the people that have taken the courses, they're like, I really still don't even know about it. Like, it's kind of interesting from that standpoint, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, man, I think like someday I want to do a presentation. I'm sure somebody will do it before me by the time I'm ready, if they haven't done it already. But I would love to see a presentation on FMS, FRC, PRI, AFS, or Gray Institute. I'm probably missing, right, one or two. DNS, if you want to throw DNS in there. But whatever, all these
RPR
different
or whatever,
RPR, exactly. These different methodologies and systems. And they're like, this is how I implement that and that. This is how they work together. This is how they disagree. I would love to someday feel like I'm perfectly integrating all of them. You know, I'm certainly trying to layer them in, or concepts and principles of each one in. I think, man, it's just like remembering, and I had a good conversation with a coach the other day over the phone, is like, strength and conditioning is so glued to the pillars of weightlifting and of powerlifting, right? Because they were sports before strength and conditioning was a field, pretty much. And so we love talking about bench press, squat, deadlift, clean, you know, snatch, not as common, but clean and jerk, snatch, right? And all those things are great. But at the end of the day, it's about improving physical qualities and improving outputs that, you know, we talk about. We just want our athletes to be bigger, faster, stronger, and then they get better on the court. But hopefully the qualities we're building allow them to be better athletes and allow them to ultimately be better at their sport, or at least give them a better window, a higher window, or better potential to be better at the sport, right? So for me, it's just about tying them all together, man, as best as I possibly can to, like, yeah, I want to make sure they have a structurally good shoulder from an FMS assessment or FRC standpoint, whatever I choose to use for that. But I also want to make sure the shoulder integrates with all the rest of the body. And I understand that to some degree it's all attached. So, you know, not to say we're not going to do an arm farm, and we're not going to do some heavy pressing and pulling in a isolated fashion, but I'm also going to try to do more compound movements where the entire body is involved. And we're putting 2 or even 3 different movements together, so that especially after they build that base of strength and movement quality, okay, I can't just squat in one plane or hinge in one plane or this foot position or that foot position or row from a perfect sagittal. I can rotate and reach and create a sling that way, just giving them kind of movement variability, right? And giving them the movement competency to understand the basics of a squat, hinge, push, pull, etc. But then do that in multiple planes and ultimately any plane, right? Because on the court and in the field of play, you don't get to take a bar and do a squat or do a perfect squat as you go into your jump shot. There's so much variability, right? You never see one exact movement or exercise on the court. There's thousands, who knows how many. So giving them the physical qualities and the movement competency to do the traditional patterns that we love to talk about and train, but also then giving them the ability to do it in different planes and different fashions. To me, I think, just in my opinion of what I've learned so far, will give them a little better potential to translate it to the court.
It's very interesting when we look at the multitude of methods. You know, you look at vertical integration of programming, right? So like, okay, cool, I got my max strength, speed, and my power work, and now I got my energy system development, and I'm making sure I'm sprinting. And now it's like, okay, now kind of do the same thing with movement. Now throw your FRC in there. Now throw some breathing in there. Now throw, you know, from a movement variability or movement competency standpoint, throw, I don't even want to say FMS, but you could throw that, I suppose, right?
Sure.
I feel like it's kind of maybe slightly dying a little bit, and then you throw in some of this other stuff. It's like getting all of that, you know, the buckets, if you will, and ensuring all of them have this nice, beautiful bow, and that we're always consistently hitting them is extremely difficult, right?
Yeah.
It is extremely. The more you learn about a certain subject too, the more maybe your program leans towards that way, or the more it goes away from. Because some people can learn something like, we ain't ever doing that, right? And so it's tough. It's tough to balance all of that, and then do it in a time constraint, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hey, you got 2 or 3 days a week for 1 hour, right? And you're like, Well, we're gonna condition for like 40 minutes.
Yeah.
You know, that's the tough part, right? And it's so tough, and it's becoming. I think we're getting more time to do those things, but I think it's also tougher to do those things. So, what does it look like, if you will? How are you integrating FRC stuff? How are you integrating, more fascial lining, if you will? What does like a maybe particular exercise look like for you and for your teams?
Sure. So, I'm sure you've seen Vipers. We have some of those. Only 6. I would love to have more so we could use them as a whole team at once. So it's more of a group training situation or a circuit training situation. But we'll do some different lunge matrices with the Vipers. At Coppin, we had heavier ones, so we could really only do lower body stuff. So we would do a 3D line, a few different 3D lunge series, 3D pivot. We even got into 3D hip hinges, right? Why not be able to hip hinge outside of the sagittal plane? So laterally, rotationally. Here at Drexel, we have lighter Vipers right now, so we'll do more overhead stuff. So we might go into a lunge with a frontal plane driver or an overhead driver. I've even built them into ISOs. So like ISOs, obviously we know, can be good for tendon health and just general stability, and blood flow without much soreness or muscle damage. I'll throw in a Viper to that. So say it's a floating heel, split squat floating heel ISO for whatever benefits we want with that. And then throw in some, as AFS and Gary Gray Institute call them, drivers, rotational drivers or frontal plane drivers or sagittal overhead drivers. So challenging their multidimensional stability, like through all their quote unquote fascia, all their tissues, while they're holding an isometric position, or dynamic lunges, reaches, presses, etc. So that's one example. And I think just, as I alluded to earlier, like tying in those multi movements or exercises. Right. Yeah. So like a snatch to a push, or clean to a push press, or things of that nature, a reverse lunge to a step up, more kind of Franz Boschi, but things of that nature, right? Making them multidimensional and kind of a little more complex, a little more dynamic stability, things of that nature is definitely one area. Try to build it into the warm up too as well. They do talk in that book a little bit about the benefit of doing fascial based stuff after basketball activity, to kind of, because they use the same muscles over and over and over in similar ways during basketball, doing some fascial stuff to kind of open everything back up and restore everything, so adhesions aren't built up as much. So yeah, man, that's kind of the areas, I would say, the main areas where we're getting into more fascial based stuff. I'll be honest with FRC. I just took it in March. I think it was late March. FRA and FRC. Yeah, it was a 3-day dual course, and it was great, man. But I'm still figuring out exactly how I want to build it into the team setting. Because as you know, like cars, I don't even like doing cars. Like, they're really boring. And in order to get something out of them, you have to give a high level of intent. And it doesn't feel the same as just going through a dynamic stretch or hip rock or whatever, right? And then pails and rails are great too, but also very tedious. And if you're doing them right, technically require 1 to 2 minutes to get, per set or per, exercise or muscle group at least. So that's also tedious. And then getting our guys to actually pay attention and lock in and work through both, pails and rails. So I'm still figuring out how I want to implement it in the team setting, and maybe a little bit more of an individual or need-based, type of thing, or small group type of thing for me. This summer, I'll begin to toy with it and play with it a little bit this summer.
Sure.
But, I think something, man, like to tie it all together, and the most important thing you mentioned earlier is the principles, right? And they said that at the FRC course, and I think most good courses will say it, like, you don't have to do exactly what we say. If you can take the principles and apply it to your world and how it's going to work for you, that's the most important thing, and I think, like, it is important for us to remember too, that there is a business side of it. So there might be a lot of good principles and a lot of good, stuff to take away, but it doesn't mean everything they say is perfect because it's a certification. They had an idea, they built out the idea, and then they made it $1,000 course that they get all these people to pay for, right? And so, of course, to them, it's their Bible, but it doesn't mean it has to be our Bible, and it doesn't mean we have to do every single thing from every single course. But yeah, man, I think trying to take the stuff that we find most valuable and applicable, and the principles from that is what I'm trying to do.
Gosh, I think that last point is so important. I really think that last point is so important. because I think what you see a lot of times is people are going at one additional certification, which is great. I love the continuing ed. I love the personal professional development. That's amazing. There's a lot of good things that come from that. However, just because you did that one doesn't mean it's always what you should do. Right. And I think a lot of people kind of struggle with that at times. You'll see people that will go and get a certification and then all they want to do is that one thing, right? Like, and they live by it, they swear by it. And I'm not saying that it doesn't work. So I think a lot of them probably do have really good merit to them. But it's really interesting because then it's like they're known as that guy, right? And it's like, well, wouldn't it be beneficial if we all took them and took the parts from them that we find most beneficial, that our athletes find most beneficial, that's most beneficial in our constraints-based approach or constraints-based actual environment and apply those rather than always being like, this is always, I'm not even going to say anything because I don't want to, this one has changed my life, blah, blah, whatever. They all probably have benefit. Don't get me wrong. They all probably have good things to them. But it's really interesting to kind of see from that standpoint, with other new ones popping up about neurologicals and everything from that standpoint. It's so interesting to kind of see that. I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, man. I think, and I know I mentioned some exercise earlier in terms of the quote unquote fascial stuff. Just another, I think a simple example. You talk about a bench press, whether it's barbell or dumbbell, it's a compound movement, but it's ultimately just a chest exercise, right? It's a horizontal press. I think when you begin to think about things from a fascial standpoint, all that means is making it a little more complex and a little more whole body integrated. So I think a good example of that is, okay, maybe instead of dumbbell barbell pressing all day, we do a single arm cable press, right? Maybe we add a rotational component to it. Now that whole interior sling or interior line of tissue is being challenged, strength at length. Maybe now we add more rotation or we add a split squat into a press or punch, right? Now it's a little more, even more whole body dynamic. So not to get back into the weeds, that was just another example that I thought make more sense. And when you talk about, more traditional exercises and then maybe something a little more towards the fascially driven type of exercise that still checks the same box. Just maybe a little more athletic, if we want to call it that.
Yeah, that makes it interesting. It's almost like a level of a progression, if you will.
Yeah.
Like now, instead of progressing movements, right? Like, I'm sorry, not movements, but instead of progressing weight or volume or intensity, you're saying we're challenging now maybe dynamic stability. We're challenging the fascial lines a little bit more, which could mean a reduction in weight, but we add a rotational element to it, right? Obviously, that it's going to challenge a little bit more, or we go into a split squat stance, which is potentially less stable compared to, an athletic position. Right. And so, it's really interesting. Like, I don't know, man, it kind of makes my brain hurt, but
I think honestly, man, I think a lot of people are doing what could be labeled quote unquote fascia training or fascial based training. Yeah. It's just because it's still newer and we don't have a full understanding of it yet. We don't realize it, and it's become like a buzzword, but it's like, well, like I think a lot of good training incorporates some more fascially driven stuff versus muscle driven stuff.
You think we just do it inadvertently and we just don't call it fascial training or working the anterior sling or whatever? We just inadvertently do it. Right. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of common exercises that 80 to 90% of us do 80 to 90% of the time. Talk about ab rollouts and anterior sling, right? Like that kind of thing. Yeah. I think there's a lot of things that we do that we just maybe don't realize it or don't call it that. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so funny because how we all wear multiple hats, right? Like whatever it is, we're the sports scientist, we're the nutritionist, we're the strength coach, we're the logistics coordinator, whatever. It's like now we also have different lenses we're looking through too. Obviously the strength coach, the potential powerlifting, the bodybuilding lens, the sprinting lens, the FRC lens, you name it. And it just keeps going and going and going and going and going. It's just like, wow, that's crazy, right? And that doesn't even include any of the, actual thought process programming and the admin tasks and all that stuff that go with it. It's crazy how it just there's just so much more and more and more that continues to be explored in a good way, right? Like it's cool to see the exploration of it, and I think all of it has merit, and I think all of it has some benefit. Now, figuring out what's beneficial to you and in your setting, that's where it gets really individualized.
Yeah, man, and the other tricky part about this stuff as you get more complex or variable or whatever, and I think part of the reason that we fall back to bench press, squat, deadlift, clean, and variations of is because coaches, sport coaches, head coaches understand those exercises, and they understand NBA combine 185, 10, not bad, 15, yeah, pretty good, right? They can go and see whatever, right? Squat, they squat 300, yeah, that's pretty good. Right. Those are frames of reference that they can relate to and potentially want to see numbers go up in. Whereas, and that's something I asked Bill Parisi this past year when I got to visit with him. I was like, man, like the one thing I'm struggling on with the quote unquote fascial based training stuff is how do we quantify improvement, or what is a KPI for fascial based stuff? And to me, I think it's just like translating to more functional athleticism in their field of sport.
Sure.
But does that mean, okay, if they're a better basketball player than it worked, like, it gets so gray and murky.
How do you measure that too? You know,
exactly.
Like, how do you measure a most functional athlete?
Statistics on the court, like I don't know, because then we're talking about if someone's not getting better at basketball, then it's our fault, right? So that's a little dangerous. But yeah, man, I think that's what part of what makes it tricky too is being able to define improvement in those areas and or improvement in performance.
Yeah, it's well, just like that in general is like, how do you define a strength or like what do you consider KPIs for evaluation for strength coaches, right? Like define that, right? Like everybody, you talk to 10 different coaches, you'll get 10 different answers on that, right? Yeah. And that's interesting in itself, right? Depending upon where you're at too on the hierarchy, I don't know. It's wild, isn't it though?
Yeah, man. Conversations that I don't know that we'll ever have answers to, at least not anytime soon. I don't think.
Not anytime soon, though. Chris, man, where can people find you online?
Yeah, I think mainly Instagram. So at C Hayes Strength, and Hayes is Hays. I spell it for people all the time, and they still get it wrong. But C Hayes Strength, 2 S's. I'm on Twitter too, not as active on Twitter. A lot more just like retweets of Drexel stuff. Occasionally tweet. But yeah, man, mainly IG, Twitter a little bit. I'm on LinkedIn too and Facebook and all that stuff. But I would say IG is the main one.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Guys, Chris, I want to thank you for your time. Go reach out to Chris online. He's really intelligent. He's awesome to talk to. And I'm super excited for what you have going on and to see how this year, how the success comes to you this year. And so I'm very interested in that. This was fantastic. I want to acknowledge you and who you are and what you're doing, man. And keep fighting the good fight, bro. Even though at times it's tough, it's draining. But keep fighting the good fight, man. I believe in you and what you're doing. So, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for who you are and what you're doing. Guys, go reach out to Chris. I think that's just utterly important to continue to reach out to people and continue to, network with them and, kind of learn what they're doing and have conversations with them.
Absolutely, man. I appreciate you for having me. And we didn't really get fully to our backstory, but the way we met was I went with Coach Spiker, our men's head coach, to Army for a visit just to hang out with him and meet with your basketball staff. And on the way there, I said, it'd probably be a good idea if I reached out to their strength coach to try to connect with him. And I'm pretty sure it was that morning and you made time to connect with me and to, shadow a session and everything. And Kendrick gave me some really good ideas with what he was doing with goal setting and some stuff with the team. So anyway, man, I'm grateful for our relationship and that we connected and are staying connected. We wouldn't be where we are without each other, right? Without our mentors and our colleagues. So I appreciate you, man, and what you're doing for the field.
Yeah, well, thank you, man. I just try to. It was great how we connected. Honestly, it was. It was really good, and it was great to have the conversations and shake hands and me, you, and Gabe, and sit there and just kind of talk. Right? I think that's so important. I just think it's utterly important, and then to continue to have the relationship that we have and we'll continue to have it going forward. So I appreciate that. Guys, look, if you got anything from this episode, if your brain is like, some of this stuff I need to look into, because that's what mine's telling me, then this is a good indicator that you're being stretched and that you are developing too, which is a huge thing. So if you have questions, you're like, what is FRC? What is, PRI? What is some of this other stuff? This is an indicator for you. And this is what's amazing about these other people is they introduce you to other things, concepts, methods that you need to now go research. You need to now go look at. You need to now go explore and go down these rabbit holes because it's only going to help make you a better coach. It's going to be tough at first, but it's only going to help you make you a better coach. So go do that. And if you got anything from this episode, if you laughed with us, if you were like, oh man, that's an aha moment for me too, man, I've been there. I've struggled with injuries. I've, had those years. Do us a huge favor, share the show, share it with a friend and be like, man, you're here too, or whatever the case may be. That's the only way the show grows. Would much, much appreciate that and your guys' continued support. If you're on YouTube watching the full-length YouTube episodes, just a huge favor, hit the subscribe button as we would appreciate that. So, Chris, man, thank you for your time, brother. I appreciate you, and I look forward to more conversations with you, man.
You too, Kendrick. I'll talk to you soon, man. Thank you.
Yes, sir. We'll catch y'all on the next one.